Let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt completely exhausted mentally, but somehow still had the energy for physical activities? Or perhaps you've been physically tired, but your mind was racing with ideas? What if I told you this isn't just a quirk of human experience, but evidence of different energy centers within you that operate independently? Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Mark Roach. And today we're exploring a profound concept from Maurice Nicoll's psychological commentaries on the teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. This work offers us a revolutionary understanding of human energy and consciousness that can transform how we approach our daily lives. Let's begin with Nicoll's explanation of force in the work. I quote here, "Let us speak about force. When you do a thing too long, you have no force. Some people have difficulty in separating their idea of force from the idea of physical force. But there are many kinds of force that act on us. From the work point of view, when a man is completely asleep, he has no force. That is, he has no work force. He is then in life. All force is made through some form of self-knowledge. I mean, that all workforce is made in this way. You can be enormously powerful in a physical sense, and yet from the work point of view, you have no force." End quote. Now, for my life, when I turned 19, I faced a pivotal moment that would reshape my understanding of force and purpose. I had accepted a scholarship to play major college football, the culmination of years of athletic achievement. For years, football had served as the perfect outlet for the anger that I carried inside. Emotions stemming from being sexually molested when I was 5 years old, trauma that I had never properly addressed. What had worked so well in my familiar environment that I grew up in suddenly collapsed when I found myself in a new community on a college campus, surrounded by a bunch of young men. The emotional mechanisms that I had relied on for years began to fail me. In this new setting, I experienced a profound awakening, a moment of genuine self-observation when I realized I was no longer enjoying football. This activity that had defined me, that I had excelled at for years, was no longer serving my deeper self. This clarity let me make a decision that went against all external expectations and the promise of a materialistic lifestyle. I chose to step away from pursuing football professionally. This wasn't a failure. Rather, it was my first real act of consciousness, choosing based on inner truth rather than mechanical patterns. Looking back, I can see how I had been operating entirely on what Nicoll would call life force, the energy of anger, trauma, and identification with external achievement. My physical strength and athletic prowess gave me power in the conventional sense, but I was spiritually and psychologically asleep, running on automatic pilot. That moment of recognition, seeing that I was destroying my body, mind, spirit, and soul by continuing to operate from unprocessed anger, was my first real experience of work force. It came through self-knowledge, through seeing myself rather objectively, operating mechanically, continuing along a predetermined path. This turning point marked the beginning of a journey toward becoming more true to my authentic calling rather than conforming to external expectations. A fundamental shift from being asleep in life to awakening to the possibility of conscious development. Nicoll continues with a fascinating explanation of our different centers, and I quote again here. Let us try to speak as simply as possible about force. We have different centers in us. Each center requires a different kind of energy or force for it to work properly. There is, for example, force in moving center. A man may have great energy connected with his moving center and no energy for his intellectual center. Now, if such a man uses all his force, let us say, in moving center, he will not understand what it means to have force in the intellectual center. Forces or energies in us are of different kinds. End quote. Now, when I was 42, I was still very active physically, playing highly competitive basketball in several leagues in Houston, Texas. I was quite good. I was playing 5 to 8 times a week. And this wasn't casual recreation for me. It was intense, demanding, and consumed much of my energy. At the same time, I was working in business and financial services, applying my engineering background and experience from travels around the world in energy and consulting. I was applying to life or adapting to life apart from my children and an ex-wife who had parted after she realized that she wanted something different in her life. I wasn't dealing with all of my personal issues. Instead, I was venting most of my energy into rather violent physical experience, channeling everything into highly competitive athletic endeavors. And this pattern wasn't new. I mean, it stretched back into my childhood when I first learned to use physical activity to avoid dealing with emotional pain, particularly the unhealed wounds from childhood sexual abuse. Then came the surgery. Although I eventually recovered physically, being forced into inactivity created a profound shift. Initially, I became extremely depressed and saddened. My moving center, which had always been a primary source of my energy and identity, was temporarily shut down. Without access to that familiar force, I felt completely depleted. This injury that I suffered in basketball certainly impacted my identity and the way that I would live the rest of my life. Yet alongside the depression came something unexpected, a sense of relief from the burden of the pattern that I had carried since childhood. I was ready to let that identity go. The external outlets, the physical power, the achievements that had defined me, I was finally forced to turn inward. And this was the beginning of a very dark but insightful period for me. With my moving center temporarily unavailable, I discovered other centers of energy that I had neglected, my emotional center in particular, my intellectual center. I began learning about my inner life, exploring dimensions of myself that had been overshadowed by physical activity and achievement and materialism. What I came to understand was that I hadn't actually been strong in a complete sense. I had tremendous force in my moving center, but had never developed comparable energy in my other centers. The physical limitations forced me to discover these different types of forces, the energy of introspection, the emotional processing, and of intellectual understanding. This period of recovery became a spiritual awakening of sorts. I realized that true balance wasn't about excelling in one area while neglecting others, but about developing and harmonizing different types of energy within myself. The very thing that seemed like a devastating loss, my physical capability, became the doorway to discovering forces within me that I never knew existed. This understanding of multiple centers within us leads to a profound insight about human potential. and I'll quote Nicoll here, the idea of balanced man that I often think dominates our work, or should do so, is that of a man who has force that can pass at different times into different centers, because balanced man is a man who can use all his centers at the appropriate times. A one-centered man, a one-sided man, employs his force, such as he has mechanically, chiefly in one center. But the work says that we must eventually come to the point of being able to use all the centers with their right energies, otherwise we remain ungrown, undeveloped. After sharing my journey from being dominated by my moving center in athletics and then discovering other centers during my forced physical inactivity, I'd like to share a more recent chapter that illustrates what true balance looks like in practice. When I began creating content for this channel, I encountered a fascinating challenge. I had developed considerable intellectual understanding of these esoteric teachings through my years of study. My intellectual center was fully engaged. I had also done deep emotional work, processing trauma and developing my emotional center through therapy and inner work. But something was missing. My videos felt stiff and overly academic, and the knowledge was there, but it wasn't connecting with viewers. And I was primarily using my intellectual center with some engagement of my emotional center, but I disconnected from my moving center. This disconnect wasn't for lack of training. I mean, I'd studied acting for over 20 years. And then in my 50s, I dedicated 5 years to an intensive Meisner technique study, which is a very inward approach. And the Meisner approach is fundamentally about authentic response, living truthfully under imaginary circumstances, and it teaches you to work from your whole being, not just your intellect. Yet there was a profound difference between applying these skills to fictional characters and using them to express my authentic self. In fiction and entertainment, there's a built-in distance, a safety net. The stakes aren't truly personal. But in sharing my life experiences with the wisdom that I've gained through suffering, that requires a different kind of courage and integration. I remember one particular day when I was struggling to record, take after take, I felt lifeless. Out of frustration, I stepped away from the camera and reconnected with what I'd learned through Meisner, the importance of being fully present in my body, not just my thoughts, not the competitive adrenaline fueled by movement in my basketball or football days, but mindful, intentional embodiment. I returned to the camera with my body awakened, and suddenly everything flowed. My intellectual understanding remained intact and emotional connection was present. But now my moving center was also engaged in my gestures, my posture, my breathing, my voice. This wasn't about performance or entertainment. It was about creating creating a contrived production or establishing a new profession. It was about authentic communication, using all centers harmoniously to reach my fellow human beings who might benefit from what I'd learned through my own experiences, suffering, healing. This experience taught me something profound about what Nicoll calls the balanced man. It's not about abandoning one center for another, nor is it about using all centers simultaneously for every task. Rather, it's about having flexibilities to engage the appropriate center at the appropriate time and to harmonize them when needed. The work of balancing these centers continues daily. But I found that when I can engage the appropriate center for each situation or harmonize multiple centers when needed, I experience a quality of presence, flow, effectiveness that wasn't possible when I was predominantly a one-centered man. This integration isn't a luxury or a performance technique. It's essential to me as the air that I breathe. It's how I can be held accountable to myself and to the truth of my experience, offering it as a resource to others walking similar paths, not as entertainment or diversion, but as an authentic human connection across all centers of our being. Now, Nicoll concludes this section with a practical observation about our daily experience. We have 5 ordinary centers: the intellectual center, the emotional center, the sex center, the moving center, and the instinctive center. A full man has, at the right times, force in all these 5 centers, and the force is quite different in each case. You cannot, for example, use intellectual force for lifting weights. Quite different force has to be employed." End quote. The implications of this teaching are profound. When we understand that we possess different types of energy centers, we can begin to consciously direct our attention and efforts. Rather than pushing against exhaustion in one center, we can shift to another that's still fresh and vital. Next time you feel depleted, ask yourself, which center am I overusing? Which centers remained untapped? This simple awareness can transform your relationship with energy, productivity, and ultimately your experience of life itself. I'm Mark Roach with Transcendent. If you found value in today's exploration, please subscribe and join our community as we continue to uncover the deeper wisdom that can transform our understanding of ourselves and our potential. Until next time, all the best on your journey.